week ago tonight in Ottawa, Corporal Nathan Cirillo was preparing for his War Memorial Guard duties the next day. During those duties, the 24-year-old single father was shot and killed, the second Canadian Forces member to die from an attack in 48 hours. Canadians were and still are in shock over what happened. Homegrown terror strikes at home. What happens now? In a moment, our Turning Point panel. Janice Stein is the director of the Monk School of Global Affairs. Ray Boisvert is a former assistant director at CSIS. Saeed Khan is fellow at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. And Dr. Samantha Nutt is the founder of War Child Canada. Their thoughts in a moment, but first, this context. Last week was awful.
Everybody back up right now. Move!
But the fact homegrown terrorists are amongst us is not new. Just a few weeks ago, security and intelligence officials were testifying in those same Parliament buildings that there are dozens and dozens of potential homegrown terrorists in the country.
We have about 63 active national security investigations on 90 individuals.
And that ISIS is actively recruiting more to fight with them both overseas and at home.
So I was like your everyday, regular Canadian before Islam.
Coordinated by a Canadian.
Just last year, the CBC's Adrian Arsenault was the first to uncover a major Canadian connection to terrorism, an assault on a North African gas plant that left dozens dead after a hostage-taking turned into a bloodbath. Some of the key people behind the attack, young Canadians from London, Ontario.
Ali Medledge, it appears, may have helped design the attack.
Later, Arsenault uncovered more cells for extremism in Calgary.
He shared an apartment in the same Calgary building.
Ones with direct links to ISIS.
We have no information indicating an imminent attack, but we have to remain vigilant.
Then, last week, near Montreal and in Ottawa, two examples that apparently point to homegrown terror targeted not for overseas, but right here in Canada. So where is all this heading? And does last week mean things have taken a dramatic new turn that needs new countermeasures?
We will not overact, but it is also time that we stop underreacting to the great threats against us.
Is the greatest threat from Canadian terrorists at home or abroad?
We will destroy you.
In trying to stop the threat, what's the greatest danger? Underreaction or overreaction? Lots of questions. Let's try for some answers. All right, let's pick it right up there. Where is the greatest threat, home or abroad?
It's actually both, Peter. We saw last week that we have a problem at home, but it would be foolish to ignore the problem of Canadians who go overseas and fight. They come back either disillusioned with what they saw, that's the hopeful story, or skilled, expert, and able to inflict real damage.
Right?
Absolutely. When it's at home, it's direct. You can feel it. It's immediate. When it's overseas, it's longer term, a little more pervasive in terms of it touches a large part of the world, but it's more opaque, so they don't have that immediate impact. Nevertheless, the outcomes, as Janice says, is the same. It's about death and destruction, and it's long-term or a short-term issue. So they both interact together.
Saeed, both?
No, I would say actually the bigger threat is overseas, and actually as a result of mistaken identity. I fear that most Canadians, if they are going to be threatened overseas, are going to be mistaken either for Americans or Europeans. The threat level against Canada still isn't that high, and what we find here is in the case of the domestic acts over the last week, they seem to be rather more pointed toward non-civilians.
Sam?
I would say the greatest threat is if you're Iraqi or Syrian. It's people who are living within the region, and we've had atrocities that have been committed, war crimes. And so the way that I look at this is that it's anybody who goes overseas and who's supporting that kind of agenda, that's where the biggest risk is. That's where you have the largest numbers of civilian casualties, and that's where we should be extremely concerned. You
know, after last week, the two incidents, both have been described by the authorities that both these people were self-radicalized. How real is that threat of self-radicalization?
Oh, it's real and affects a lot of areas, too. It's just not the religious extremist piece. We've seen in other jurisdictions involving other types of ideology. And it is that. It's a politicized religious ideology. So it's very much a personal journey that people take. Quite often it might be at a very difficult time in their lives. There may be some emotional factors, instability, other things. Usually quite often from people who are somewhat disenfranchised. But I've also seen it coming from cases where people had very solid backgrounds. Nevertheless, it's usually the pathology is more towards those who have been disenfranchised or suddenly feel that they have a reason to hate. And they follow that, they fall into the prey to that message that at the end of the day, the West is at war with Islam. And it's false, but they believe it.
Sam.
I agree with what Ray said. If you look at the drivers of homegrown terrorism, it is a confluence of variables, and there are certain risk factors that go along with that. It's social marginalization, it's family troubles, school problems, usually a precipitating crisis of some kind. And so the ideology becomes one piece that ends up putting people into a certain place in their lives, a certain moment, that turns them into to have a certain kind of threat level. But it's no greater a threat, for example, than what we saw in Moncton. There was a young man who also had a very dangerous ideology, a hateful ideology, and we need to keep that into perspective. So I would say yes, it's real, but it is a case where we actually have a number of examples where this takes place, and it's not just the threat of self-radicalization; it's all of these other things that,
I want to
we're seeing in
disagree
society.
just a little bit, because I think it is bigger, and I think we are going to make a big mistake if we underestimate it. And here's why it's bigger. 25 years ago, angry, disaffected young men and some women would have joined the Hells Angels or would have joined the Mafia, depending, there were outlets. Right now, there is such an aggressive campaign of web-based recruiting going on that it becomes the first stop for many people, and that's the problem that not only Canada faces, but other countries as well.
But the issue of pathology, I think, is really critical here. The number of school shootings that we find, the number of mass killings that we find, issues of mental illness, issues of substance abuse, issues of disenfranchisement, not fitting in, not belonging, identity crises. These seem to be a common denominator which is being missed in a lot of these cases. There's probably not much hope that we have to go ahead and counter ideologies because that's emanating from a different source. But there is something that we can do in order to try to find and perhaps even remedy the issue of the pathological problems that a lot of these individuals have in common.
And that's a vital point, right? If you look at school shooters and you look at others, there is a tremendous overlap between what we're seeing in the psychology of those young people and people who become self-radicalized. I think that's very important.
All right, but how do you counter it?
Yeah, I was saying back to Janice's point, you're really stuck with this issue of we're being outgunned in social media. And the voices that are going to have to engage in that cannot be those of the state or the authorities or the police. So it has to be others in the community. So the best way to counter it is really direct, immediate, and informal. So that means local people in their lives, their physicians, their families, their friends, their teachers, and getting at them early and giving them a different view of the world and hopefully having some influence. Once it gets to the state where the authorities, being either CSIS or the RCMP, are engaged, then it's too late. The outcome will be one that's not going to help anybody. And the other problem I have is at the end of the day, once they're arrested or detained, what do you do after they're released? We have this big de-radicalization problem that nobody solved.
Ray is completely right. In fact, what do we know really is effective when leaders in the Muslim community, imams in local mosques, speak out, actually describe these acts of violence as shameful. It then becomes much, much more difficult to justify the ideology that is in its violent and extreme form.
But you have these two examples of last week, and I realize they're just two examples, but they're not as connected to the Muslim community as we used to think on some of these issues. I mean, they were connected, but this kind of radicalization was not the same.
It's like biker gangs. It's that whole thing. I was always worried about, I used to work drug section in a previous life. I was worried about the strikers, the ones who want to wear the patches and become the real members. Right. They were far more dangerous. We're seeing the same thing with converts to some degree.
There's a difference between them.
In this case, by the way, the Muslim community in Vancouver, where he was, actually identified him as a problem.
Right.
So he wasn't on the CSIS watch list, but the local community. So there's a bit of a missing link here, right?
Right.
We need that next step because they did identify.
They did identify that there could be a problem here.
Yeah.
Sam, you wanted to say something?
I was just going to say there's a difference between the motivators and the drivers. So there's no, for example, connection that we have yet established between the Ottawa killer and ISIS. There's no direct connection. Now, that doesn't mean that he won't have been sympathetic to their cause or inspired by their cause, but to say that he was in any way plugged in directly with that network and being being pushed by that network. At this point, we certainly have no evidence of that.
Let me just raise it to another issue, a broader issue. Not surprisingly, we're all looking very focused at what happened in Canada last week, but and the impact that it has on us. How about on the global security question? Saeed, is there a connection between what happened here and the bigger global security issue?
Well, clearly there is, but not as direct as one might want to look at. And again, I don't think that this is really so much a focus of ideology. In the United States, you have a lot of people, and particularly because this is a midterm election year, exploiting the issue by saying we need more surveillance and more surveillance of mosques. None of these individuals is radicalizing in a mosque. They're radicalizing in basements. They're radicalizing in internet cafes. And I think what's important to then recognize, and I think the point that has to be conceded, is that many Muslim communities are ill-equipped as to how to integrate converts. And also, they're very ill-equipped on dealing with mental illness and substance abuse. So to go ahead and put all of these burdens on just the Muslim community, to then go ahead and identify things that they don't have the metrics to identify, is a very tall order.
Give me the global security answer on this.
I think when not only in Canada, Peter, but as you say rightly, this is a problem. In Australia, it's a problem in Britain, and it's not a question of direct links. This is not an organization, the way we used to think about organizations. That's not the issue. The issue is we have very effective recruitment online. So it's right to, in a sense, talk about cyber recruiting. Now, what does that do? It increases insecurity. Paradoxically, incidents like we had in Canada last week actually encourage that recruiting. So it inflames everything, these kinds of acts. You know, the final comment I would make is about Muslim community leaders. They're actually playing a remarkable role in this country. They are at the forefront of identifying young people. They think they do have that capability, and they are really playing an extraordinary role.
And they have, in fact, spoken out. In some of the cases, it's been members of the community themselves coming forward and say that person is deeply radicalized. I've been to Saudi Arabia. I've visited the Radicalization Center. It's an important thing, but it's a big, big state enterprise involving huge dollars. To some effect, yes, but I think best is local, again, informal, involving the voices, the parents, the brothers, and the sisters of those who've been radicalized.
All right, I'm going to have to take a break here, so I want to do this very quickly. But, you know, we spent a great deal of time in the early 2000s worrying about al-Qaeda and how serious a threat it posed. Is the ISIS threat greater than what we've witnessed before? Sam?
If you're living in the region, yes, the ISIS threat is much greater. And if you look even at the trajectory of Iraq, we went in 2003, prior to 2003, of having no evidence of al-Qaeda to then having al-Qaeda and al-Nusra, and now having ISIS. So that is certainly not an encouraging trajectory in terms of the level of violence that's been experienced. So I would say on the whole, regionally, yes, this is a very grave threat. Whether that actually results in a much greater threat to us living on this side of the world as opposed to al-Qaeda, for example, still there's no evidence of that. So I think we need to proceed with a certain degree of caution here.
All right, in 10 seconds or less, Ray, you're the security expert.
It's one big interconnected world. What happens here will have an impact there. The wires connect the voices, the ideas, the methods, and the simple sort of motivation to get it done. So whether it's a cyber attack or it's a physical attack, there's no more small individual villages. Everything's connected.
But are they more of a threat now?
They are, because they have amplified effect through the internet and other means. And plus, people, when they go into conflict zones, they get further radicalized, they learn the weapons of war, and they become extremely unpredictable. This is the challenge of radicalization. Sometimes people become radicalized, but we never know if they're actually going to act out. If they come back from a war zone, it's more likely.
All right, we've got to take that quick break I was talking about, but when we come back, this question. ISIS is real. It's a clear and present risk. But is there a risk for us of overreaction? And welcome back to our turning point on ISIS and Canada's homegrown terror. At the table tonight, Janice Stein, Ray Boisvert, Saeed Khan, and Sam Nutt. Ottawa and governments around the world, for that matter, are trying to determine how to deal with this situation. Is there a potential problem here of overreacting, Saeed?
Well, there always is. I mean, what happened in Ottawa and what happened in Quebec is quite heinous. The imagery, the bloodshed that's involved, the senseless loss of life is always going to evoke a lot of emotion, and that emotion is something that politicians are going to feel too. After all, they're human beings. But there is this danger that through legislation, through efforts of increased surveillance or even targeted surveillance, that we're missing the point, or we're not being as surgical when it comes to trying to deal with this issue.
Sam.
I'm going to take a different tack with this question, Peter, in that I think that we have underreacted to threats that are occurring in other parts of the world. We underreacted to the Ebola crisis. We've underreacted to the problems that are plaguing conflict and post-conflict states, in particular the political problems that have been in Iraq for more than a decade now in other parts of the world, South Sudan, for example. And the more that you have these protracted conflicts in which people become more upset, angry, there's huge loss of life, then this is a risk that affects us all. And when we don't engage in those conversations and respond to those crises, unfortunately, these are situations that tend to grow exponentially.
Janice.
I think there's a huge danger of overreaction, Peter, and it's in the overreaction that governments and security agencies discredit themselves. So we have to be extremely smart over the next few months. For example, CSIS now does not have enough agents to follow those 90 people. We need to double the budget of CSIS and hire extra agents and train people, but we don't need more powers. So we need to be really smart.
Right.
Well, I think underreacting is not an option either, and overreacting has its consequences. Being in that business, I can tell you, we knew we'd be judged one way or the other. If we overreacted and we stepped over the line, there would be consequences from a legal, from a charter perspective, and so on. And then, of course, you get put in the penalty box and things have to start over again. If you underdo it, then there are lives that are at risk. So I think in terms of a strategy, it has to be a multi-pronged approach. We talked about the earlier resilience building and the abilities to sort of deconflict and try to break down those issues. Secondly, you have to go and do the outreach. It has to be happening over there because those are some of the root causes, and it has a spillover effect. And finally, I'm not sure if we have the resolve or we have the tenacity and the nerve. I think we have to take some risk, and that may involve also encouraging some people to come home. If we do, it's a very difficult game. That means more resources and impacts on places like CSIS and the RCMP, CBSA, and others. How do they manage the borders? How do they manage the people coming in? But I think those are assets we need to get out of those theaters, those conflict zones, and I think they'll give us lots of opportunity because they will see, they know now what they were doing over there was wrong, and they were trying to get away and get out, but they feel like now they can't come home. So I think that's a challenge.
That's a really interesting point. Listen, all of you, thank you so much for your thoughts on this one. It's a complicated question. And thank you as well. Lots more on all of this online at cbcnews.ca/thenational.